If you spend any time in the healthcare field, chances are you're going to run into several of these diseases. So it's important that you understand how they come about so you can treat your patients properly. Hey everybody, Organized Biology here with the second rendition of Pathophysiology of Common Diseases. If you haven't watched the first one, hop over here. But we're going to talk specifically about blood, autoimmune diseases, some infections, as well as bones and joints and common diseases of those organ structures. So to start, I want to look at the blood. We know that the blood is a river of life, traveling, carrying blood to every single cell virtually of your body, giving it that oxygen it needs. So fun fact, you have approximately 60,000 miles worth of blood vessels in your body. That's insane. It's a lot of traveling. And coursing through the highways of your blood vessels are going to be these very important cells called red blood cells. I'm just going to shorten them up as RBCs. Sometimes they're called erythrocytes, literally translating to red cell. Now, these red blood cells have a very important job to do, namely to carry oxygen, that gas, as well as that CO2 throughout the bloodstream. Now, oxygen is going to help deliver it to the cells so that they can make ATP, that energy, and then CO2 carrying it to the lungs so that we can breathe it out. Now, if we have an issue with the amount of these red blood cells, namely if we have too little, we call that anemia. Anemia. Let's look at that word here. So emia usually just refers to blood in general. We're specifically talking about red blood cells here, but that "an" in front always means without. So in this case, we are quite literally without blood. We have a low red blood cell count, or we can have a low hemoglobin count. We're going to talk about that in a second. Now, when we have anemia, we classify it as if you have under this value of homeostasis. So remember, with homeostasis, we got a set range of values. We need to keep in that range in order to stay healthy and alive. Now, if you have less than 4 to 6 times 10 to the 12th red blood cells per liter, you're considered anemic. So we'll say this person has a 3.2, so pretty low, right? Furthermore, we may also have another value. This is actually a value of hemoglobin, shortened up HB, and that's going to be a protein inside of your red blood cells that we're going to zoom in on a second. And if we have below 130, it's different for men and women. We're going to say it's at 115. This person is straight up anemic. They don't have as many red blood cells. Now, why am I talking about hemoglobin? Let's focus in on that because it's going to be the key to why you get anemia. Well, if we zoom in, this is the hemoglobin protein, hemoglobin. Let's break that word down. Anytime you see globin in A&P or any other class, it means carrier protein. The protein, IN, and then glob, kind of like a glob of protein carrying something, okay? Now that heme always refers to either blood or iron containing. Iron containing is going to be the main thing we're focusing on. So I'm going to write iron containing. Okay, so hemoglobin is always in the gym because it's always pumping iron. If I didn't have a punchline sound effect, I digress. Anyway, so it's an iron-containing carrier protein. And in fact, 98% of your red blood cells are made of just straight up hemoglobin. So 98% of your red blood cells are made of hemoglobin. So it's a very important protein. What does it do? Well, we know that it's iron-containing. I drew that as an orange thing. So iron, Fe, that's what it's like on the periodic table, Fe, short for ferrous. It is going to be in the center part of these 4 protein molecules, okay? So you see that iron in the center. We've got 2 beta units, okay? So 2 beta proteins of the hemoglobin, 2 alpha units. That's not as important, just wanted to point it out. So we call this a tetrameric protein. Tetrameric, meaning 4 units, okay? Now, within that iron, why is it so important? Because iron is really good at oxidizing, in other words, rusting, but oxidizing in this case means it can hold onto an oxygen molecule. So the main way we carry oxygen throughout the body is because oxygen binds to that iron in the hemoglobin protein. Now, fun fact, iron can also grab onto CO2, as I mentioned earlier, so we can go back and forth. You can actually learn about that in the Bohren-Haldane effects video later on. Okay, so we know that then the hemoglobin protein is made of primarily iron, as well as, if it's a protein, all of these individual units of the protein are called amino acids, right? So amino acids, base unit of protein. So we basically got a bunch of amino acids chained together, several iron atoms, and we're holding onto oxygen, carrying it throughout the body. Why is that important? Why did I teach you that? Well, because we're talking about the disease anemia. You are without blood. And think about it. If these are like the cars that carry oxygen throughout the blood, in order to build the cars, what do you think you need? Well, you need obviously the metal, the iron, and then in this case, you need the amino acids. Now, for most people, your amino acids, you're fine. You're eating plenty of protein, but the iron is pesky. Now, the iron we can lose, and then we don't have enough material to build our red blood cells. So, we need to know that usually anemia is caused by iron deficiency. Iron deficiency anemia. Basically saying you're not getting enough iron in your body, right? Now, how can this happen? Well, iron deficiency it doesn't only, but it mostly occurs in women. Can you predict why? Well, obviously with women, you have a menstrual cycle. So every month or so, you're losing blood. So for women, the menstrual cycle is a big indicator, or a big risk factor, I should say, for losing iron, because when you go through your menstrual cycle, you are going to lose blood and you are therefore going to lose iron. Okay? Makes sense, right? So obviously, if you're a woman bleeding out, you need to replace this with iron-rich foods, right? So in order to fix this, you need to eat more iron. Now, iron is primarily found in red meats. It's also found in iron-fortified cereals. You can take an iron supplement, several other things, but mainly we need to eat this iron, okay? So why would that cause these values to be low? We don't have enough to build the hemoglobin, therefore we can't build our red blood cells. It makes sense. Now, furthermore, not only can iron be low, but we can also think that your ferritin can be low. So iron deficiency anemia may be masked as actually a ferritin deficiency. Now, what is ferritin? Well, you may not have heard of this before, but ferritin, fer meaning basically iron, fer is sulfate, and then in protein, okay? So it's a protein and iron deficiency. Ferritin is basically a storage molecule or protein for your iron. So sometimes, although your iron levels can be normal, your ferritin levels can be low, basically telling you, a healthcare professional that tested that, hey, I've got low stored iron, so I'm at higher risk for anemia, okay? So if you go to the doctor, not only test your iron, but also test your ferritin amount, because it could indicate underlying issues with your iron storage. Very cool. Now, one quick thing, why don't men get this as much? Well, obviously they're not bleeding as much, but if you're not bleeding, if you're not losing blood, you can actually recycle this very well. So I want you to know that iron is very well recycled, very well recycled. You can actually learn about that in this video here about red blood cell recycling. But it is recycled very well. I flipped those words. I apologize. Okay, so we know that iron deficiency anemia can cause it, but also, not only that, but we can also have B12 deficiency. Vitamin B12 deficiency can also lead to anemia. Why is that? Well, some background here. Vitamin B12 is called cobalamin, okay? It's an essential vitamin that we need to get in our diet. Now, when a red blood cell is produced, we require this vitamin in order to produce it. So we need to introduce a new cell called a hemocytoblast. Hemocytoblast. Big fancy word for basically blood stem cell. Anytime you see blast, it's usually a stem cell. Cyto means cell. Heme means iron containing or blood, right? So this hemocytoblast, in order to differentiate itself, so change itself into a red blood cell, we require the vitamin B12, okay? It's actually a coenzyme for several chemical reactions to allow that cell to turn into red blood cells. So obviously, if you are deficient in B12, you could lead to less red blood cells. Last one I'm going to mention here, you may have fine absorption, you may eat plenty of B12, but in order to actually absorb B12, you need a hormone called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor, shortened up IF. Some people don't make much of this, And intrinsic factor allows basically your small intestine to absorb the B12 into your bloodstream. So you may be eating plenty of vitamin B12, but you may not be absorbing it as successfully. So some people have low intrinsic factor and they need help basically absorbing the vitamin B12. Very fascinating. So anemia obviously can look a lot of different ways. It could be an iron issue, you're not eating enough and you're losing blood. It could be a ferritin, a storage issue, so you don't have enough stored to build the red blood cells. It could also be a B12 deficiency, okay? Now let's move on to a different type of anemia, and it's actually going to be hereditary, okay? It's genetic, where you're basically receiving bad genes, per se, from your parents. Now, before we get into that, I just want to mention, hey, what do you think anemia would do to you? What do you think anemia would do to you? Like, if you had anemia, what would you feel like, do you think? You guys are probably smart. No, I know you are smart. If you follow me, you're smart, right? That was very selfish. But if you have low red blood cells, you have low oxygen. If you are hypoxic, low oxygen levels, you're going to be exhausted a lot. Think of like if you're wearing one of those gas or altitude masks and you're like running around and you're not getting enough oxygen. That's how you'll feel all the time. You'll feel exhausted because you're not oxygenating your tissues properly and you need it to make that energy. Brilliant. Okay, so let's move on into the hereditary. Well, we know that these hemoglobin molecules, proteins, were produced by your cells, right? So in your body, in your DNA, you have what's called a hemoglobin gene. Hemoglobin gene. Now, the one we're looking at here is the beta strand, okay? And that is found specifically on chromosome 11. If you need a review on your genetics, go ahead and watch this video later on. So the hemoglobin gene is found on chromosome 11. Now, we know that you always have two variations of the same gene, right? So you have two copies of the same gene, but they might be slightly different. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say the hemoglobin gene for that beta unit can be an allele called, I'll do it in a different color, it can be an allele called big H, okay? And that's going to code for a normal hemoglobin. So I'm just going to say normal HB. But you could also have an allele, a variation of the gene, as a lowercase h. That will translate to a sickled hemoglobin gene, HB. Now I'm saying sickled, you probably know what's coming. It's sickle cell anemia. Okay, so let's say, for example, you have a mom. So this is you. This is you. I'm going to put a little smiley face because obviously you're smiling during this video. And this is you, and you get genes from your parents. How does that work? Well, your parents obviously have two sets of the hemoglobin gene. We'll say mom has a big H and a little h. So she's heterozygous. She's got a good set of gene and then a bad one, right, for the sickled hemoglobin. She will not have sickled hemoglobin. She'll have normal red blood cells, which is absolutely fascinating. And same with dad. We're going to say he's big H, little h as well. Now, the law of independent assortment says, hey, when we make a child, only one of the two genes can get passed on. So we'll say you're the unlucky one. You get the little h from dad, and you get the little h from your mom, okay? That means that your genotype, fancy word for what genes you have, is little h, little h. This will translate to a sickle cell trait, both recessive alleles, and you're going to have sickle cell anemia. What does that mean? Well, it means when you're producing your hemoglobin from these genes, it's not going to be shaped properly. And we know when the structure isn't right, the function isn't right, right? So if we're looking inside of this person's blood, right, we're zooming in on it here, we would see some normal red blood cells, which is absolutely fascinating. You may have some normal ones, but then you'll also have some that look like a crescent moon. Some that look like a crescent moon here, okay? Now, why is that a problem? Structure fits function. Normally, when blood cells get into the capillaries, small blood vessels in your body, their smallest one, there's only one that can fit in at a time. They're so tiny, only one red blood cell can fit through at a time. But if you have these sickled cells, chances are you may get blocked up in those capillaries. You see how like the sickle gets caught in those capillaries? Well, now we have a lack of blood flow. There's no blood flow going down through here, right? If the blood's flowing this way, we can't get blood through there anymore because it's stuck, right? So therefore, all the cells downstream of that, say these are like the cells of your body, what's going to happen to them? well, they're not going to get the oxygen they need, right? So they are going to begin to die. This blockage of blood flow is called ischemia, okay? So you can have different ischemic attacks where different parts of your body just hurt really bad and you're not sure why. Well, it's likely that your sickled blood plugged up those blood vessels and now you're not getting oxygen to those areas. So to treat that, you could try different blood thinners and different things. I'm not going to talk about treatments in this video all that much, but yeah, that is what sickle cell anemia does. And how do you get it? Genetically, right? Now, if you want to know why, this is actually more common in the African American population because if you are heterozygous and you come from African American descent where there was malaria, that malarial parasite that infected your red blood cells, you are actually resistant to malaria if you have the heterozygous. But that's also a problem because if you are little h, you don't make the hemoglobin right, but you are also basically immune to malaria. So it's kind of an interesting natural selection thing going on there. Whereas, let's say if you were big H, you got normal red blood cells altogether, you would actually be very susceptible to malaria. So if you were susceptible to malaria, you would likely die in those environments. So that is why that sickle cell trait got passed on, because it was a heterozygous selection. A lot of cool words. Again, you can watch that genetics video if you want to learn more about it. All right, so that was a lot on anemia, right? Low red blood cell count, low oxygen, therefore cells start to die, you get really tired. Now let's move on into the counterpart blood cells, the white blood cells. Those hemocytoblasts I mentioned were stem cells, and we know that stem cells can differentiate into a variety of different cell types. And in this case, we're going to differentiate into white blood cells, okay? So I'm drawing them blue, and they actually kind of appear that way if you put them under a dye. And we're going to look specifically at a couple of these. So one will be lymphocytes, and then one will be macrophages, so big eater cells. All right. So what do these white blood cells do? Well, normally they are going to fight infections, right? You've probably heard or seen like white blood cells going and attacking bacteria and viruses, and that's all well and good. Well, how do they do that? Well, the lymphocytes, they will produce these molecules called antibodies. These are little, basically daggers that will stick themselves into a pathogen. So let's say there's like a little bacteria here. This bacteria will have a little ID tag antigen, and that antibody will attach to it and basically target that bacteria for destruction. Okay, that's very crash course immune system. Okay, so once the lymphocytes do that, however, the macrophages can actually see that. Think of these guys, these antibodies, as basically glowing orbs that this macrophage can see really well. So once it gets tagged on a bacteria or a pathogen, virus, whatever, that macrophage can find it very easily and it can eat those pathogens, okay? So they kind of work in tandem, right? The lymphocytes find it, attach the antibodies to attack it, macrophages come and eat it, okay? Now, that can go wrong, but we're gonna show how it can go wrong in two different cases. One will be in the lungs, and then one will be in the bones and the joints, okay? And then we're gonna finish off with some osteoporosis. If this has been helpful, by the way, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, really appreciate it. So let's move on into the lungs. So let's zoom in onto the lungs. And we know that inside the lungs, we have these little air sacs called alveoli, very important. Alveoli will have very thin cells, okay, called squamous, simple squamous cells, that will allow the diffusion of oxygen and CO2 from the blood out to the air, okay? Very fascinating process. But the problem is sometimes these areas and the cells surrounding the area can get infected, okay? So let's say, for example, there was a bacteria that got in here, and we're going to say the bacteria is Mycobacteria tuberculosis. You may have heard of this guy before. Tuberculosis. There we go. I can't write and speak at the same time. You probably noticed that in a lot of my videos. Now, this is very specific bacteria that spreads in people in cloistered areas. It spreads through respiratory droplets. And this bacteria loves to get into the airways, Once it does, it can begin to infect and make some different toxins and this type of thing and basically invade the alveolar sac, okay? Now, when that occurs, obviously we're going to get widespread inflammation of that area, and we're not going to be able to breathe as properly, okay? So that can lead to potentially what we're going to talk about next, pneumonia. But we're just going to say this tuberculosis has to be treated by antibiotics. Okay, so remember, in order to treat it, we've got to have those antibiotics. Antibiotics treat bacteria. Remember that. They do not treat viruses, so antibiotics won't help viruses. They just kill off the bacteria. So there's a specific round of antibiotics you can use to fight it off, and you'll be good to go. Now, the problem with any infection of the lungs is that it could turn into something called pneumonia. Now, pneumonia, let's write that in, pneumonia literally translates to breath. So pneumon or pneumo is breath, and then basically condition of the breath. It doesn't really tell you what it does, but with pneumonia, we're going to have fluid accumulation. Fluid accumulation in the lungs. Fluid accumulation in the lungs. Why is that happening? Why would you just start having fluid accumulation? Well, let's talk first about why it would be bad. Well, if you have water droplets basically filling this area or other fluids due to different things, how do you think your breathing is going to go? Well, obviously, if we have more fluid in here filling this space up, all of the gases like oxygen and CO2 cannot pass through as easily, right? So oxygen would not be able to get through as well. It might get blocked. CO2 can't get out. So now you're going to have issues breathing, okay? And then you're going to have issues getting oxygen to the rest of the tissues of your body. Not good. What causes pneumonia? Well, any sort of infection of the lungs. So I'm going to say infection of lungs leads to pneumonia. It could be the specific Streptococcus pneumoniae bacteria. It could be COVID-19. It could be other respiratory viruses. It could even be fungi in people with suppressed immune diseases, immune systems, okay? So anything that infects the lungs that causes that fluid accumulation can lead to pneumonia. Now, why does this occur again? Why does fluid accumulation occur? Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever had like a cut on your skin and maybe it got a little infected and it started to kind of bulge up a little bit and you were kind of grossed out by it? Or maybe you just had even like a blood blister and that like fluid built up in there? Well, anytime you have some sort of damage or infection to an area, fluid likes to accumulate there. The reason for that is because the blood vessels surrounding the area get very, very permeable. So in other words, they will be able to lose fluid from the blood and leak things like the white blood cells, like platelets, into those spaces. So anytime you have an infection, blood vessels open up, get more permeable. Now you're having fluid accumulation into that area. Couple that with killing off bacteria and building up a bunch of dead cells, and you have even more fluid accumulation, okay? So again, pneumonia can be caused by any sort of infection leading to opening of the blood vessels, leading to that fluid accumulation. Now, why is pneumonia so scary? Well, pneumonia, a lot of the time, not a lot of the times, but more common than not, can lead to something called sepsis. This is very dangerous. Sepsis is when you have some sort of localized infection somewhere in the body, could be the lungs, could be the legs or arms or what have you, and it's going to spread throughout the body. So sepsis is classified by an infection that leads to widespread inflammatory response. Inflammatory response. Okay. And it could even be an infection of the blood where the bacteria or the pathogen gets into the bloodstream and now can travel all over the place. But it's usually indicated by an inflammatory response. What is inflammation? Well, in this case, we have these white blood cells like lymphocytes, like basophils a lot of the times too. They won't only make antibodies. That's not the only thing they produce. But these lymphocytes specifically create molecules called ILs. These are interleukins, literally translating to between white blood cell protein. Now, the interleukins are known to be highly inflammatory, okay? So I want you to remember I for interleukins, very inflammatory. I'm writing that in red so you can remember inflammatory, okay? That basically means it's going to draw more blood to the area. It's going to create chemicals that speed up the blood in that area. It's going to draw cells to the area. It's going to cause a lot of stuff to happen, and that's good to heal a specific part of the body, but it's bad when it is widespread, right? So in this case, when you have pneumonia, you have an infection, that inflammatory response can lead to widespread inflammation throughout the rest of the blood, throughout the rest of the body, throughout the rest of the organs of your body. So now your organs are going to become inflamed and they're not going to function properly. There might be fluid accumulation in organs you don't want fluid accumulation in, and that can lead to organ failure and death very, very rapidly. So sepsis is a medical emergency. You got to get antibiotics if it's a bacterial infection. You've got to get a bunch of fluids. You got to get a bunch of potentially insulin treatments, because when you're in inflammatory state, you have high blood sugar that can also cause damage to kidneys. A lot of crap can go on with sepsis. So that's why with pneumonia, you want to catch it early so that it doesn't lead to that basically septic shock where you could die. Okay, let's move on into joints then. Okay, we've talked a little bit about how the immune system works. What's happening in our joints? Well, two main issues of the joints and the bones we will hear of will be rheumatoid arthritis. So we'll say rheumatoid arthritis. We're also going to talk about gout, two very, very different pathophysiologies. Let's start first with rheumatoid arthritis. You may have heard of this, like if your grandparents have it, or maybe your parents have it. Well, rheuma or rheumatoid, interestingly, means stream or a flow of something, okay? So a stream or flow. And that was named because when people had this arthritis, inflammation of joints, it felt as though it was flowing throughout their body, right? So it was like flowing throughout many joints, and that's why they called it rheumatoid. Kind of interesting, right? Now this occurs, rheumatoid arthritis, when your white blood cells, I'll just say WBCs, attack something called the synovium. The synovium. So things like lymphocytes will attack the synovium. What's the synovium? Well, we know in between most of the movable joints of your body, like your knuckles, your elbow joint, all sorts of places, we have synovial fluid inside here. So I'm going to show this here. This is called synovial fluid. You can see where we got the name synovium. Synovial fluid, I want you to remember, is like WD-40. It is like the oil, the greaser of your joints to allow them to move so fluidly with virtually no friction, which is incredible, by the way. But what produces the synovial fluid? Well, the synovial membrane. So I drew here the synovial membrane, and these are the cells that will actually produce that fluid and spew it into that space so they can be used as that lubrication. In this case, however, we will have the white blood cells migrating into here and surrounding areas and begin attacking this synovium from inside out, essentially. Why does it do that? Why do autoimmune diseases come about? It's so frustrating, we still don't know the answer to that, okay? A lot of people say it's just due to some sort of major stressor. It could be a life event even. It could be maybe you get like a bad bout of food poisoning and your body just goes into this autoimmune disease. It's just crazy. There could be genetic links. We don't know why, but we're just gonna say white blood cells begin attacking that synovium, again, from inside out. And we know when we begin attacking something, there's gonna be inflammation to it. So now we're going to produce some of those interleukins that we talked about, right? If we make those interleukins, now we have inflammation of the joints, arthritis, right? Makes sense. But what's nasty about rheumatoid arthritis is, like I said, we attack from the inside out. Imagine these white blood cells as like little pickaxes, just chopping away, chopping away, chopping away at the surrounding tissues. Those surrounding tissues could be the articular cartilage of your bones. Articular cartilage exists to basically protect the ends of the bones from getting damaged. And that's not good if that begins to wear off. It's like you're taking away the plastic cap on your bones, and now you can have bone-on-bone contact. Not only that, but the white blood cells can attack so strongly that they actually begin damaging the edges of the bones as well. Now you're going to get deformed bones that might have little divots in them like this. So if you look at a person with rheumatoid arthritis, especially if their hands could be just bent all out of shape because those white blood cells are just attacking those joints and they're changing shape all over the place. Really nasty disease. Now, what's interesting is how to treat it. Since it's an immune response that's causing this issue, immune suppressor drugs are actually the best way to treat it because we're going to suppress that immune response and prevent all of this from happening too quickly. But it usually is a progressive disease and it's not reversible at the moment. There are some good clinical trials coming out, so we don't know in the future, but for now, it is irreversible, which is really nasty. Okay, so that is rheumatoid arthritis. Now, gout, very, very different pathophysiology. Gout, interestingly enough, is caused by excess uric acid. So I'm going to say gout. I'll come down here with gout. Gout is due to excess uric acid, and that leads to crystallization. Okay, a few things here. Excess uric acid. What the heck is that, Mr. J? Well, urea, kind of sounds similar. This is a byproduct of protein metabolism. So I want you to point out uric acid is a byproduct. Okay, basically it's produced when you're breaking down proteins. Okay, so when would you need to break down proteins? Well, when you eat too much proteins and you have too much, so you need to break it down to get it out of your body. So gout, excess uric acid is usually due to a very high protein diet. It could also be due to excess alcohol consumption because alcohol consumption, both of them contain basically the main ingredients to produce uric acid. It's actually called a purine side chain. And so both of these things have high uric acid when we metabolize it, and that could lead to crystallization. Okay, well, what's crystallization here? Well, normally, for example, I eat a relatively high protein diet and I don't have gout. You might eat a high protein diet and you don't have gout. Maybe we have alcohol consumption. Why don't we get these crystals? Well, there's some risk factors here. Number one is when you need to clear this uric acid out, it needs to be cleared out through the kidneys. So if you have a few things, number one, kidney disease, it is a high risk factor for leading to gout because as you make that uric acid, it builds up, your kidneys need to clear it, but if your kidneys aren't working properly, you can't clear it out very well. So now it's going to back up and stay in your body, okay? The second thing is going to be obesity. Reason for that, it's likely because it puts a little more pressure on the kidneys because you have more blood when you are obese. And it could also be, when we're going to talk about the joint aspect of it, you're putting a lot of pressure on those joints, so you feel it a lot more. Okay, so this is uric acid though, and we know that it can be cleared out through the kidneys, okay? So how is uric acid turning into a solid, right? I said crystallization. Well, it can do that in two different places, both of which are very nasty. One, the gout crystals, we'll say, can accumulate in the joints. So I'm going to draw this uric acid just kind of as like triangles here. And they can accumulate in actually the between parts of bones called joints. That's what a joint is, right? Space between the bones. So those uric acid crystals can accumulate there, and obviously that's going to cause some pain because you're putting pressure on those joints, and if there's sharp crystals there, it's going to just feel really like a sharp pain whenever you're putting pressure on those joints. Now, question, why do they crystallize in your joints? I mean, this is uric acid, it's in your blood, or in your plasma specifically of your blood. Why is it crystallizing in your joints versus just any other place? Well, it's because interestingly, it is very cool to do so. It's not actually cool, but it's colder. The temperature between your joints is colder because there's less blood supply and you don't need it to be that warm. And so therefore, we know most things, when they get colder, they can crystallize a little better. Have you ever had fat in like a beef stew and then you put it in the fridge and there's that like layer of solid fat? It's essentially crystallized fat. It's solidifying. Same thing here. It was in the fluid. Now it's crystallizing in a cooler place. So that's really interesting. That's why it actually crystallizes in the joints of all places. But secondly, you could probably guess, I'm telling you that the kidneys have to clear it out. Gout can lead to kidney stones. Why? Because if it's peed out by basically the kidneys filtering it out, if we have too much, right? And it gets all clumped together, it could form stones inside of your kidneys. And obviously that is a very, very painful thing. Okay, so that's about gout. Last thing with last thing with bones we're going to talk about very briefly is osteoporosis. Osteoporosis, okay, what do we got here? Bone holy condition. Bone holy condition. So we look at porous, right? Holy. Osis, condition of bones. So it's literally holy bone syndrome. Holy bone syndrome. Now, do not think you are a saint because you have holy bone syndrome. No, it's basically when your bones lose their density. Okay, bones are losing their density. Why does this happen? Well, inside of your bones, we know we've got some cool cells. I'm going to zoom in here on your bones. We've got some cool cells. One cell type, it's not in this orientation, I'm just going to draw them, are called osteoclasts. They literally look like the little ghost from Pac-Man. So osteoclasts, and I want you to remember osteoclasts crack down the bone. They break it down, they dissolve it. It's going to lead to osteoporosis here in a second. The second cell type is going to be osteocytes. Osteocytes will maintain the bone matrix. They're just going to chill out there, keep the bone steady and strong. And then we also have our osteoblasts. Osteoblasts, they are going to be the builder cells. And interesting, they came from a type of stem cell to connect that last concept. Blast kind of means stem cell. Now, osteoblasts build the matrix, build bone. I said earlier, osteoclasts break bone down. In the terms of osteoporosis, whose activity is ramped up? Osteoclast activity is ramped up in osteoporosis, and osteoblast activity is decreased. Okay? Why is that occurring? Why do you have bone cells that are breaking down bone and your builder cells are not building it back up in osteoporosis? Couple reasons. Number one can be low activity. Interestingly enough, when you walk, when you do resistance exercise, you stimulate the osteoblasts. You basically tell them, start building bone. We're putting pressure on you. Build the bone, build the bone. I think of them as like little construction workers on the side of the highway when the contractor walks in and all the guys actually have something to do at that point and they start building and doing their stuff, right? The osteoblasts just need a little kick in the butt from pressure, from movement in order to start building bone, right? So obviously, if you have low activity, you're not building your bone, you're likely going to break it down. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. The second thing is specifically if you are a postmenopausal woman. Postmenopausal woman. Why? Postmenopausal women produce less estrogen. And interestingly enough, estrogen is a very important hormone that basically tells the osteoblasts to build bone. So this whole time of your life, you've been telling osteoblasts, yo, here's some estrogen, make some bone. Here's some estrogen, make some bone. But then all of a sudden at menopause, you drop in estrogen. Now your osteoblasts stop working, right? It's like the contractor just left and all the construction workers just kind of sit on the side of the road eating their snacks, okay? So osteoblast activity decreases, therefore you're not going to build much bone anymore. Last one, 3, I'm going to write it up here because I don't have enough room, is low vitamin D consumption or production by your skin, you don't get out as much, or just low calcium in your diet. Also, low magnesium can also be a link to osteoporosis. But obviously, looking at vitamin D and calcium, calcium makes up most of your bones. It's called hydroxyapatite. Vitamin D is a vital hormone to help that process solidify itself. Same thing with magnesium. So if you don't get these in your diet, you have a higher risk of getting osteoporosis. And that's probably why, as you get older, if you're not eating as much, not eating healthy as much, as you get older, it's higher chances to get osteoporosis because you're having low activity and you're not getting what you need. So my grandparents always said, drink your milk every day, whatever your opinions are on milk. Hey, hopefully this is helpful. If you want part 3, you can head over here if it's done, or you can hop back to part 1. Thanks for watching.